70 years of stability, 3 debt cycles, 1 inevitable end. Is the dollar system already broken? Have you ever stopped to calculate the real cost of your life? Not just the rent or the groceries, but the hidden cost. The cost of watching the value of your paycheck shrink every single year. The cost of a housing market that makes ownership a distant dream for your generation, even though your parents bought their first home on a single income. You feel this constant, gnawing financial anxiety, and you're told it's normal. You're told it's just the market. But what if that instability is not an accident? What if the stability you were promised, the 70 years of global financial peace anchored by the world's most powerful currency, was always an illusion built on a foundation of ever-increasing debt? This is the untold history of the modern world's greatest financial experiment. An experiment engineered by politicians and bankers that changed the very nature of money and debt, transforming it from a promise of value into a weapon of control. From the ashes of World War II, the world was given a system that appeared safe, a gold-backed currency that seemed unbreakable. That system is now in the final phase of its collapse. This isn't about barbarians at the gate. This is about the rot at the core of the dollar system. To understand the inevitable end, you must first understand the beginning. Go back to 1944. The place is Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The Second World War is still raging, but the architects of the new global order, primarily American and British delegates, are already drawing the blueprint for the post-war financial world. The goal was to prevent the chaos of the interwar years, the competitive currency devaluations, the financial instability that had fed 2 world wars. The solution was the American dollar. At Bretton Woods, the United States was the clear victor. They held 2/3 of the world's gold reserves, shipped there for safekeeping during the war. This was the moment the world agreed to an unprecedented architecture. The dollar would be pegged to gold at a fixed price of $35 an ounce. All other major world currencies, the British pound, the French franc, the German mark, would in turn be pegged to the dollar. It was stability defined. It made the dollar the global reserve currency. Every international trade, every oil contract, every government bond now depended on the solemn promise of the United States that they would maintain the discipline to back every printed dollar with real gold. This was the ultimate confidence game, and for 70 years the English-speaking world, and subsequently the entire globe, lived under its protective umbrella. It was the longest period of financial stability in modern history, but it was also a slow-motion trap. For decades, the system worked, fueled by American prosperity and the rebuilding of Europe and Asia. The dollar was indeed as good as gold, but the temptation of empire, the cost of global hegemony, proved too great for the U.S. government's discipline. By the 1960s, the U.S. Treasury was bleeding gold. The cost of the Vietnam War, combined with massive domestic spending on programs like the Great Society, meant the U.S. was printing far more dollars than the gold in Fort Knox could possibly back. The world was being flooded with American paper money. This wasn't just a technical issue, it was a betrayal of the promise made at Bretton Woods. Foreign governments and central banks, mainly France and the United Kingdom, noticed. They started to get nervous. They understood the basic rule of finance. Paper is only as good as the promise behind it. And that promise was gold. They began demanding redemption. They exchanged their dollars for physical gold. The confidence game was ending. The crisis peaked in August 1971. In a move that ripped the foundation out from beneath the global economy, President Richard Nixon walked into a television studio and announced the unthinkable. The United States was unilaterally closing the gold window. The dollar would no longer be convertible into gold. It was a temporary measure, he claimed, to stop speculators. But it was a lie that became permanent policy. It was the official end of the Bretton Woods system. It was the moment the dollar, and by extension the entire global financial system, became untethered, floating free, backed by nothing but the full faith and credit of the American government. That moment in 1971 was the quiet revolution. It didn't involve tanks or barricades. It was a bureaucratic decision that changed everything. It took money, which had been a physical store of value for 5,000 years, and turned it into pure debt, backed only by trust and the government's infinite ability to print more. It fundamentally rewrote the rules of the game for every citizen in the English-speaking world. The debt clock began to tick faster, because now governments could borrow and spend without any physical constraint. This unleashed the three massive debt cycles that now define our reality. The consequences of that decision, made more than 50 years ago, are the reason your cost of living is rising and your savings are evaporating today. It created a reality where debt is no longer a temporary tool for growth, but the permanent, essential product that keeps the entire global economy running. The system had gone from a foundation of stable metal to a pyramid of unstable promises. The end of the gold standard in 1971 did more than just free the dollar. It freed debt itself. It transformed governments from cautious stewards of money into insatiable borrowers. With the ability to create currency at will, central banks discovered they could patch every financial crack, fight every war, and promise every social program simply by creating more debt. Every political problem was now solvable with a financial injection. But this debt-based system, divorced from any real scarcity, created a predictable, repeating pattern of boom, bust, and bailout. These are the three debt cycles that have marched the world closer to a systemic reckoning. Cycle 1. The inflationary hangover and the debt-fueled 80s. The 1970s saw a massive inflationary hangover as the new paper-backed dollar devalued globally. The cost of oil skyrocketed and prices rose relentlessly, eroding the savings of ordinary families across the US and the UK. The inflation rate in the US peaked at nearly 15%. This crisis required a dramatic response. Enter Paul Volcker, the Federal Reserve Chairman, who slammed the brakes on the money supply by hiking interest rates to a painful 20%. This crushing move broke the back of inflation, but it also plunged the global economy into a recession and triggered the Latin American debt crisis, crushing emerging nations that had borrowed in dollars. The solution proposed by the political leaders of the era, Ronald Reagan in the US and Margaret Thatcher in the UK, was not a return to fiscal discipline, but a massive expansion of government borrowing. The era of deficits don't matter was born. National debt was justified as necessary to fund a vast military build-up and implement tax cuts for the wealthy under the promise that trickle-down economics would pay for it all. Instead, it created the first huge spike in peacetime public debt. The pattern was set. Crises are solved by central banks crushing the economy, followed by politicians expanding debt under the guise of patriotic necessity or economic reform, leaving the taxpayer to implicitly back the bill. Cycle 2. The Grand Deception of 2008. The next cycle arrived 20 years later in the form of the 2008 global financial crisis. This was not a public debt crisis, but a private one, based on leverage layered upon leverage. Mortgages were packaged into toxic securities, sold globally, and amplified by financial institutions using leverage ratios of 30-to-1 or more. It was a massive pyramid of debt, and when the housing market crumbled, the entire structure shook. The crisis was a clear test of the post-1971 system. Would the government let the reckless debt creators fail? The answer was a resounding no. The political and financial establishment, primarily in the US and the UK, socialized the losses, bailing out the very banks and institutions that caused the collapse with trillions of taxpayer dollars. The wealthy bondholders were protected, while millions of homeowners in the suburbs of America and the terraces of Britain faced foreclosure and austerity. The financial tricks used were unmistakable: privatize the gains in the good times and socialize the losses when the collapse comes. The public was told this was necessary to save the system, but what they really saved was the hierarchy of power within the system.